Welcome into this week's Degrees of Science. So in less than 2 weeks time frame, we had two historic storms make landfall on the Florida Gulf Coast in late September, early October. So we're talking today with our resident Floridian and hurricane expert, Sean Bellafiore. So Sean, two major hurricanes that made landfall. If you took a step back, say 5 to 10 years from now, where would these storms kind of historically lie?
This is going to rank up there as far as some of the worst hurricanes for Florida history. And of course, you know, when we're talking about Helene specifically, Florida almost was spared, it seemed like a little bit. You know, we had Hurricane Michael make landfall along the Gulf Coast in the Big Bend. We also had Idalia make landfall pretty much in the same spot. But even with all those hurricanes, I think at least for Helene, the worst of it was well inland. Yeah. We're talking in the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. So for them, this is probably one of the worst, if not the worst hurricane. But at least for, you know, if you take a step back and you take a look at Florida hurricanes, the big one's Andrew. That's the one that changed all the building codes. That's the one that really made Floridians think about how to protect themselves from these dangerous systems. And this, for at least the West Coast, was as bad as of a hurricane as they've seen in many folks' lifetimes, and it could have been a whole lot worse.
Yeah, you know, we talk so much about storm surge, but yeah, the rain, it moved inland, and I think it's going to go down as the deadliest hurricane since Hurricane Katrina. I think 250 roughly is on Helene, how many deaths there were. So, you know, a natural disaster, sometimes there's not a lot you can do to prevent bad things from happening on it, but I do need to give a shout out to the National Hurricane Center. So we're showing you the first forecasts that were put out for both Helene and Milton, and I mean, they did an awesome job. I mean, you can't prevent everything from happening, but you know, now that they have the potential tropical cyclone designation they're doing, and just the forecasting skill and the amazing work that the hurricane hunters are doing, you know, the forecast didn't shift much with these storms.
Over the last 10 years, 20 years, things have gotten so much better forecasting wise. Not only at the Hurricane Center, they've been the best at what they've done, but those tracks, I mean, they nailed the landfall location within, I want to say, 30 miles 5 days out when these storms were just starting to get going. Brady and I, we were taking a look back at some of the storms of past. You know, you're thinking some of these big names, like you mentioned Katrina, you also mentioned Rita, both in 2005. About 3 days out from landfall for Hurricane Katrina, the landfall location wasn't even in the cone.
2005, I was at this station, well, I started in June, so you talk about a young meteorologist getting thrown to the wolves when it comes to a tropical system. So, yeah, both forecasts were great. So let's step back to Hurricane Helene. So it started to form around the 23rd of September. And I guess the big thing with it was the way that it intensified as it got closer to the coast, because it didn't become a major hurricane until really the day before. And a lot of these storms, you'll see them weaken some, but this storm kept its intensity right up until, and I think that was where a lot of folks were worried about that storm surge.
Yeah, and you know, it's another one of those hurricanes of recent, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, that it's almost a given now that rapid intensification is going to occur up before landfall. We saw it with Michael. We saw it with, I believe Irma had a rapid intensification cycle close to landfall. Milton,
Ian,
Ian
some
did.
of these,
Harvey did as well, and you know, it kind of does buck the trend of thinking that, you know, once you get closer to the coast, typically more shallow water, you know, not maybe enough fuel to sustain or even strengthen a hurricane. But now, you know, these sea surface temperatures, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, they are so hot that rapid intensification, it almost feels like it's like a guarantee for some of these storms.
And this one was in both of these, pretty fast-moving hurricanes. You think of 15 to 20 miles per hour, something moving slow, but for a hurricane fast. And you were talking that the Florida coast may have dodged, or Florida may have dodged worse. As this storm moved inland, that's when everything really got bad. But this was a weird setup, because usually you have a hurricane move through, it's just that's what caused the rain. But the southeastern parts of the country had some areas nearly a foot of rain before Helene even moved in, and then you had the terrain. This was just a horrible setup when it comes to rain and flash flooding.
Yeah, mountainous terrain and tropical systems do not mix. And the Carolinas, you know, the big storm for the Carolinas of recent was Florence. That was 2018, I think, at this point. So, you know, we're talking about 6 years ago, but that was was the rainiest tropical system in the Carolinas because it just sat kind of like Hurricane Harvey did off the Texas coast. And now you get a completely different system that instead of sitting off the coast, it kind of morphed into another upper level storm system, and that the lifting, it's called topographic lifting. Whenever you get, winds moving up a mountain, that's air rising, and it just creates a lot of problems as far as rain goes. Tropical rains and mountains don't mix, and then when you get mountainous terrain and potential landslides, I mean, it was a recipe for disaster. And it's just hearing 200 plus people losing their life in a tropical system. That's something you don't hear about nowadays because, of how much of an improvement the forecasting has gotten, and, how much more resilient our homes are. But water is the number one killer in tropical systems for a reason, be it freshwater or saltwater storm surge flooding.
Yeah, and as one of those forecasts that you see, reminds me of Katrina when they put out just the life-threatening, but that was only like a day before. But they were forecasting 15 to 20 inches of rain, and that's hard for a meteorologist to go out and put that out in advance. I'm showing you right now, parts of North Carolina, 72-hour rainfall of 30 inches, and some of that doesn't even include the pre in advance. Let's switch over to Hurricane Milton. So I think you were talking rapid intensification. This one, I went to bed one night, it was a Category 1, and then by the next day, it nearly made it to Category 5. It was insane how fast the storm intensified.
Yeah, and I was watching it, while you were asleep. I was up in the morning, and this is, kind of the day before landfall, and, it's like, okay, it's Category 1 hurricane now, it's Category 2, and I think within the course of our 2.5 hour long morning newscast, pretty much every hour, the intensity was bumped up, and by a pretty significant margin. I mean, if my memory serves me correctly, we're talking about a 20 mile per hour wind speed increase over the course of a 3 hour or 2 hour time frame, and the definition for rapid intensification is 28 miles per hour in 24 hours.
And this is where the hurricane hunters help us out. I mean, being in this storm and flying through so much. So rapidly intensified. The other thing that caught a lot of people's attention on this was where it formed and the direction that it moved. This isn't an out of the question, but a rare for this system to form where it did and then move on an easterly track.
And sure, hurricanes typically don't form in the western Gulf of Mexico and track eastward, but they definitely do. And, if you kind of have a background knowledge of meteorology, once you start to get into the latter part of the hurricane season, later September and October, and, if we do get something in November, that's cold front season for the rest of the country. So, it kind of makes sense that if anything was in the Gulf of Mexico, that the upper level steering pattern would move it from west to east, or southwest northeast. The track, how it moved may have caught some folks off guard, and they may have been questioning what is going on. But even with that weirdness of where it formed, how it moved, it was still an A+ forecast from the Hurricane Center.
And we were talking again that the forecast or the Saffir-Simpson just goes off of winds. So one thing that doesn't get as much attention, but we watch a lot, is the tornadic potential with these storms. And a lot of times you'll see spin-up tornadoes. Milton was very different. We're talking some what looked like wedge tornadoes. And before the storm even made landfall on the west coast, we had significant tornadoes touching down well on the east coast of Florida.
Now, tropical storms, like you mentioned, Brady, tropical storms and hurricanes, it's a lot of spin. There's no doubt about that. But usually what you see is, like you mentioned, those quick spin-up tornadoes. This almost kind of looked to me like it was a hybrid-ish system, because we were talking about this cold front, this upper-level storm system that was moving it in this weird direction from west to east. But at the same time, I think what ended up happening is a little bit of some drier air got wrapped around the storm system, and that helped to greatly increase the instability. Typically, tropical cyclones and their parent thunderstorms don't have instability. The Cape is low, so that usually means weaker, quicker spin-up tornadoes that don't last long. But if you take a look at some of the satellite imagery, you can just see the prolific amount of lightning in those outer feeder bands. Lightning happens in these tropical systems, in these outer bands, but the amount of lightning, I think, just is kind of an attest to how much instability was in the atmosphere. And I think there was at least 2 EF3 tornadoes.
Yeah, that's rare for tropical, for sure.
I think I saw a stat somewhere that I want to say was 90% plus of tropical tornadoes are EF0 or EF1s.
Yeah, and a lot of times people don't even know the warning until it's already happened. That's how hard it's to see. But you could look at the radar that day, and it looked like a severe weather day. Not not a tropical day. And at one point, I saw right around one county, there was 5 tornado warnings in and around. I mean, I think there was over 150 warnings put out that day. So you had that, and then we started talking storm surge. But this is a good way to talk to folks about how a slight shift in a storm track can make major differences. So Tampa was extremely worried about storm surge. The bay is not very deep. It's very susceptible to storm surge. But the track made it just south of Tampa. So they went from storm surge to just being in the eye wall of this storm for hours, it seemed like.
And in fact, it was actually reverse storm surge for Tampa Bay as well. It's a small difference. Just about a 20-mile difference northward in the track would have been a complete catastrophe for the Tampa Bay area, which is one of the largest metros in the United States, one of the largest metros in Florida, of course, too. Look, if anything, this is kind of a good practice run for folks around the Tampa Bay area. Of course, they did get hit very hard. Like you mentioned, the eye wall winds, very heavy rain. Tampa broke their monthly October rainfall record in a day. Yeah. So they still got hit hard.
And then you got Tropicana Field that they thought was hurricane resistant, put all the first responders there, and then the roof gets ripped off.
Yeah, so. and again, I think this is a good lesson in kind of practice, because there will eventually be a tropical storm or a hurricane. And again, it doesn't need to be a hurricane to get big storm surge, but there will be a tropical system that does make landfall at some point in the perfect spot to give Tampa Bay 10-foot plus storm surge. And that is why, we were talking all about these evacuations, how many people were trying to get out. It was for the storm surge. And, one day the luck is going to run out.
Yeah, and Ian was just south of there, and that storm surge definitely did devastating. So, yeah, it shows kind of all the different aspects. So I know Floridians and probably all in the southeast just storm weary now, just wore out from these 2 weeks of crazy storms.
Yeah, and the fatigue is definitely real. I remember when I was growing up in South Florida, we got hit with a total of 3 hurricanes. It was Francis and Jean in 2004. I guess Katrina, we did get some impacts where we were in 2005, and then Wilma was the big one. But even though we got hit with 3 hurricanes, in the matter of about a year, the fatigue was definitely there. I can only imagine. We got kind of glancing blows from 3 different hurricanes. One of them was perfect right over us. I got to go out in the eye. So 1 direct hit, 2 like kind of indirect hits, and we were storm weary. I can only imagine folks, the Fort Myers area, this is now their 3rd major hurricane that they've gone through in like the last 3 or 4 years, actually making landfall. The same thing with the Big Bend. And even for the folks on the other side, the southeastern coast, Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade County, where they haven't really had a direct hit from a tropical system in a long time, kind of the indirect impacts, there's still some storm weariness out there, because you take a look and you see what's happening on the other side of the state, and it could easily be happening in your backyard too.
Yeah, it's kind of a ticking time bomb. It's bound to happen. It's kind of like the weariness and fatigue we had during severe weather season. Didn't have to hit you, but just that round after round after round. Well, we'll continue to track these systems, see what develops the rest of the storm season. But thanks, Sean, for giving us that insight, kind of look into both of these systems.
Of course.